Hello, 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 my dear friends. I am here to talk to you a little bit about how we're going to proceed with our mini lessons from here on out. So, right now we're going to be evaluating our mini lessons that we're writing for the students against the lenses of learning. Now, most of you have taken PLN classes before, so this should really be a review, but if you haven't, don't worry about it because we're going to go through it right now. Okay, so if you don't have it in front of you, please get that now. Get your mini lesson out that you taught, the first mini lesson, and we're going to be reviewing it and making some marks on it. Okay, so grab that and maybe something to write with. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. So first we're going to, in this next little section, we're going to review the lenses of learning and kind of look through our mini lesson to evaluate them. And then we're going to talk a little bit about how we can use mindfulness to promote self-regulation. All right, so we've talked about this a little to begin in our last class, but we're really going to get more specific this time. And then after that, I'm going to go into our next mini lesson that we're going to be doing. Okay, so tying in with the lenses of learning. All right, so ask yourself in your head if you remember the lenses of learning, and if you don't worry because they're right here. Okay, so the four lenses of learning. This is the PLN framework. Learning is language-based, it is social, it is human, and it is meaning-centered. Now, what's cool about the lenses of learning is that it's not only a framework for developing lessons, right? So many of you have been in PLN classes in the past, very familiar with the whole BDA lesson planning format, but it's actually also a way to evaluate them. So we can kind of look back over our lesson and check it for these lenses to make sure that we're including these extremely important research-based pieces that will help our students not just learn the information but also retain it. Okay, so that's what we're going to be doing now. So again, if you're multitasking, come back to me. If you do not already, please grab something to write with because you're going to make some marks on your mini lesson. And I know that you should have already handed this in. You should have uploaded it to the folder on Schoology. If you have not done so, make sure that's in there because I'm going to be checking it. But for yourself, I want you to have a paper copy in front of you right now. Okay, so let's go into the meaning-centered lens. So what you want to ask yourself is, we were teaching our students about their attention, right? Their attention's like a flashlight and they're in charge of where they point it. So how is this relevant? How did I make this lesson relevant, this concept? Think about how you connected it to what they already knew. So did you use any language in your mini lesson that connected this to what they already knew? When I modeled this for you last time, I said something like, we all know that teachers tell us to pay attention, but what does that mean, right? So I'm activating their background knowledge before just diving in and telling them what I want them to learn. So in your mini lesson, I want you to look down at your paper and I want you to put an M in a little circle by any places where you notice that you made it relevant to the students, where you connected to their background knowledge, and how they made sense of the information. Okay, so anything that relates to this meaning-centered lens, how did they make meaning out of what you were saying? Was there some turning and talking? Were they doing something on their own? How did they make sense of it, right? So looking down at that short mini lesson that you wrote and then putting a little M in a circle around any of the places where you can connect to that meaning-centered lens. Okay, so that's the first thing we're going to do right now. I'm going to give you just a second to do that. Okay. So, pop into the present. I really like this slide, and I encourage you to put something similar in your slides if you're teaching the older grades, because we expect students to just be constantly paying attention to us and not thinking about or doing anything else. And let's face the facts, you're in the middle of an online class right now, and you're probably doing something else or checking something else, or something's going on around you. So just check and see where your attention is. Okay? All right. Learning is social. We know that meaning is made through social interaction. So this is a very easy one because hopefully this happened naturally for you. How did the students interact with one another in your mini lesson? Okay, did they turn and talk? Did they share in a group? Did they, have a dialogue between one another? Did they share their voice? Who got to speak? Did you call on kids? And was there a time or a place where they could help one another, where they could assist? So, anywhere where you see a sign of the social lens, put an S with a little circle around it next to that. Wherever in your mini lesson you can find a connection to the social lens, just put an S and a circle around that. Okay, 30 more seconds to scan your document. Put a little S wherever the students got to interact with one another. So remember, right now we're looking at the lesson, not the reflection of the lesson, but the actual mini lesson that you wrote. Okay? Okay, how was language used? Obviously, lots of language was used, but how were the students relating with reading, writing, or talking? Now, in this particular lesson, they were not asked to read anything, but maybe you had them jot something down, or obviously you had them talk. So some of these lenses overlap a little bit, which is okay. And also, this one is really important at the bottom here. How did you translate this into student-friendly language? So when I modeled this lesson, obviously I talked to you about how you could talk about this if you had older students, how you could talk about this if you had younger students. So put a little L anywhere on your lesson where you feel like you used language, okay? Or you tailored the language to meet the needs of your students. Okay, so take a second to do that. Okay. All right, and now moving on to the human lens. How did you make sure that this was relevant? How did you make sure that students could understand why they care about this, why they wanted to use this? How is this important to them in particular? How did you give them a chance to be successful? How did you connect it to them? And again, you may have already marked some of this, maybe in making the language student friendly, but think about how you made sure that this lesson in particular was related to the human beings in front of you. And you talked about how they could use this in their daily life. So that's really at the bottom of the lesson where we were threading it through. Okay. So see if you can make a mark wherever you notice you use the human lens, H in a little circle. Okay. All right, so this little check that we just went through, when we come back together in class, we're going to be checking our lesson plans, but also the lesson plans of others in our families to help give some feedback on these different things. So this was really just a dry run to kind of give us a sense of how to look at this for ourselves, but we will be assisting others in this domain when we get back together. All right, so you can put that aside. It was just a little bit of information for you to have, and I want you to think about those lenses as we move into the next lesson that we're going to do later on in this online course. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about encouraging self-regulation. In whatever it is that we are teaching, we want our students to be in charge of themselves. We want them to be active learners. That means I don't need to do a song and dance and pony show and play, 5 YouTube videos for them to pay attention. I want them to be in charge of regulating themselves, to be able to notice that they're starting to get distracted, to be able to notice that they're losing focus or that they are not comprehending what they're reading. Okay? Whoop, where'd you go? If you're multitasking, come on back. So I want to talk a little bit about the difference between giving directions and actually modeling thinking. Okay, so this is a real big shift. So just take a deep breath, take a second to keep an open mind. I just want to throw this out there as something for us to start thinking about, okay? So think about if you're a phys ed teacher, right? Maybe if you're about to give some directions, you want to activate their background knowledge and you say, what do you already know about the rules of volleyball? Okay, so great job starting to give some directions. Obviously, you know where the teacher's going with this. And activating that background knowledge, pulling out that folder in the mind to kind of get that information, that content open and ready. However, there's a big difference between giving directions, telling students what to do, and modeling the thinking that you would like them to adopt. Okay, so maybe instead of asking, what do you know about the rules of volleyball, and getting a bunch of blank stares, you might then follow it with some modeling. Okay, so I would say, okay, boys and girls, I want you to take a second to think about what you already know about volleyball. Close your eyes, get into your background knowledge, into that brain file, and I would even say this to them. And then I would start talking out loud about what my brain is doing. So I would say to myself, what does my brain know about volleyball? I'm moving my attention to some memories and thoughts about the game. I remember there's serving and maybe 6 people on each side. So do you see how I am actually going through my thinking process, because we know that many of our students need this level of explicit direction of how to actually get into their brain to open up that file. All right, so many times when we give directions, we're not allowing enough think time for them to actually follow them, or we're not actually telling them how to get to that information. A lot of our kids have that information stored in their brains, but it's hard for them to get to it. So when we metacognitively model, and metacognition is really thinking about our thinking, meta, right? This meta level. When we think about our thinking, we are making what is hidden overt. We are making those hidden thoughts very clear and explicit, and we're making them, we're thinking out loud so that our students can adopt this voice into our head. So when you as a teacher are teaching, I want you to start thinking about how you can think out loud about whatever it is you're teaching. Maybe it's about how to decode a word, or how to answer a question on a test, how to attack a math problem, whatever it is. I want you to start thinking out loud so that they can start to hear your voice in their heads. Okay, so when you think out loud, they will adopt your thinking into their brains, and that's what we want. It is not helpful for me to think as a student, look at the next paragraph, and ask myself, do I understand what I read? Right? That is not as helpful for me than it is for me to hear your voice in my head helping me to check my understanding. Okay? So let's go into some reading comprehension. Okay? So if you are a teacher of anything, then you are a teacher of reading. All right? You are a teacher of students, not of content. I know you know this. And all of us are teachers of reading and literacy. Okay? So I want to hear those little hand claps, some claps going on out there. We're all reading teachers. Okay. So sometimes we give directions as we are teaching students how to read, and we say things like stop as you read, check if you understand, right? Answer these 3 questions before moving on. These are like built into our textbooks. There's these questions at the end of the paragraphs or the sections to try to quote unquote check their understanding, right? This is very different than you thinking out loud about the process of reading, okay? So maybe you say something like, oh, I'm at the end of the paragraph. Does what I read fit with what I already know about the character? Does what I read fit with what I read on the previous page? That is comprehension, my friends. When we break it down to that level, that nitty-gritty, explicit instruction, that is how we teach children how to adopt that language to then think it in their minds. Okay, so this takes time to master. This takes time to kind of analyze, and sometimes it's hard to notice when we're just giving directions after directions after directions versus when we're modeling, okay, when we're modeling thinking. So one of the things that I talk about in just helping students and guiding their behavior, instead of saying something like, what should you be doing right now? Right? We say that a lot to kids. What should you be doing right now? Right? Check yourself. What should you be doing right now? When students are off task, it's very different to instead say, I'm looking around at other students and my attention, my flashlight notices there's folders on their desks. Right? So that cues my brain to look around to other kids, to notice they all have their folders out, and here I am sitting at my desk with nothing, right? So see if you can play with this a little bit in your teaching. We are going to do a little exercise after this where you can kind of think through some of your directions to change into metacognitive modeling. So how does our mindfulness practice relate? Well, if we have poor control over attention, then it's very difficult to regulate our learning. All right. And you're seeing this now as we're getting more explicit about teaching about attention. If students have their attention all over the place in their minds, in their thoughts, in the future, in the recess yard, right? In all the things, if their attention is scattered, it's very, very difficult for them to learn, to remember, and to retrieve information from the brain. So that's why this skill is so important. If we don't teach kids and adults really how to be the master of their attention, then it is extremely difficult for them to learn, remember, think, and solve problems. Okay? So I'm going to stop right here and I'm going to ask you to go back to the folder on Schoology to see what it is that you are to do next.